This lecture will cover the immune system, and we're going to start off by talking about the 3 lines of defense. By the end of this lesson, there are a few terms that you will need to be familiar with. And those are listed here. There are also a few questions that I'd like you to think about before we continue. So if you need to pause it after I put the 3 questions up, spend some time thinking, that would be good. The first question is, what are 3 to 4 ways that viruses and other pathogens can enter our body? Second question, what are some symptoms of colds and flu? And finally, what body system allows us to fight off infections and prevent them in the future? There are 3 lines of defense the body has against pathogens. The first line of defense involves physical and chemical barriers that prevent pathogens from entering cells. The second line of defense involves immune cells that attack pathogens without specificity, and we consider that innate immunity. Finally, the third line of defense involves creation of antibodies that are specific to the invader, and we consider that adaptive immunity. The first line of defense is preventing microbes from entering our bodies in the first place, and there are a few places where that happens. The first and biggest one is the skin, but also tears, saliva, mucus and cilia, and stomach acid are all considered parts of the first line of defense. You can further break up that first line of defense into physical and chemical barriers. Physical barriers include the skin. The skin is a thick layer of dead cells in the epidermis. Well, it has a thick layer of dead cells in the epidermis, which act as a physical barrier. Shedding of this epidermis will remove microbes. Mucous membranes produce a mucus that help to trap microbes. Hair in the nose filters air containing microbes. Cilia that line the respiratory tract help to trap and propel inhaled debris to the throat. Urine flushes out of the urethra, and vomiting and diarrhea expel microbes in the GI system. All of those are considered physical barriers. Chemical barriers include a lysosome, which is an enzyme in tears, sweat, and saliva that acts as a natural antibiotic. Gastric juice in the stomach that destroys bacteria and most toxins because it's highly acidic. Saliva dilutes the number of microbes and washes the mouth and teeth. Skin is actually naturally acidic due to hyaluronic acid, which helps to inhibit bacterial growth along the skin. And also sebum, which is skin oil, acts as a protective film that inhibits bacterial growth. Pathogens that do make it past the first line of defense trigger our immune system. The immune system is a group of organs and specialized cells that help to protect us from pathogens. Key immune system organs produce immune cells. These include the tonsils, the thymus, the spleen, appendix, bone marrow, and lymph nodes. You have barriers, including nose and your mucus. You have tonsils, a series of lymph nodes spaced throughout the body. Lymphatic vessels also spaced throughout the body. The thymus, spleen, Peyer's patch, which is a small mass of lymphatic tissue that's found in the ileum of the small intestine, and that plays a role in monitoring intestinal bacteria. The appendix, and finally bone marrow. Immune system cells include white blood cells. White blood cells roam freely throughout the body, and their job is to find and destroy pathogens. There are 2 major types of white blood cells, phagocytes and lymphocytes. Phagocytes surround and destroy any pathogen, and lymphocytes make chemicals that target specific pathogens. You can see a further breakdown of the different types of immune cells here. These include rapid response cells. We consider this innate immunity, and also slow response cells, which fall under the adaptive immunity category. If we were to compare innate versus adaptive immunity, we would find that rapid response cells, or innate immunity, are non-specific defense mechanisms, and they begin working immediately or within hours of infection. These include barriers, chemicals, and cells that attack invaders. Slow response cells in the adaptive immunity category are specific defense mechanisms. They involve antigen detection and analysis, and afterward there's a creation of immune cells that attack the antigen specifically. Includes immune memory, which we will talk about. If we were to quickly run through the cells that fall under the innate immunity category, we would see that we would have macrophages, natural killer cells, mast cells, dendritic cells, neutrophil cells, basophil cells, and eosinophil cells. The specific roles of a lot of these cells are less important. What's more important is to understand that you have innate immunity cells that are nonspecific, which means they can work fast. Adaptive immunity cells include B cells, natural killer T cells, helper T cells, memory T cells, antibodies, and cytokines. And again, the specific roles of all these cells are less important, but to understand that your adaptive immune cells are slow but offer a specific response. The second line of defense involves phagocytes. The invading pathogens will trigger the immune system's nonspecific response. That nonspecific response involves phagocytes that move into the infected area. Once they're there, they surround and destroy any pathogen that they find. The phagocyte creates a set of symptoms in the area known as inflammation. Inflammation includes redness, swelling, soreness, and local warmth. The nonspecific response here involves tissue injury. After tissue injury, there'll be release of chemical signals such as histamine, dilation and increased leakiness of nearby blood vessels that will allow phagocytes to move into the area, and finally, the phagocytes consume the bacteria and the tissue heals. Some pathogens, however, will survive the first two lines of defense, and that's when the third line of defense comes into play. Chemicals on the surface of the pathogen will then trigger that specific immune response. These chemicals are recognized by the body as being foreign. They are called antigens. You can see some on the surface of that cell. The foreign antigens, and again these are molecules that signal a foreign cell, will stimulate B cells. B cells recognize the antigens and start producing proteins that are called antibodies. Antibodies will recognize and bind to the foreign antigens. Once this happens, they will work to deactivate that pathogen. But it's not quite over yet. Once an antibody has been once antigens have been tagged by antibodies, killer T cells will recognize them and destroy them. The antibodies deactivate the pathogen until the killer T cell can move in for the kill. Sort of to summarize that, all pathogens have a unique antigen on their surface that signals that molecule is foreign. The antigens are detected by B cells, which make antibodies against them. These antibodies will bind to and inactivate the pathogen. Killer T cells locate the tagged pathogens and destroy them. A few B cells also play another role, and that is an immunological memory. Memory cells are long-living cells that produce low levels of antibodies that will circulate through the body. If a second infection with the same pathogen occurs at a later date, memory cells react more vigorously to produce antibodies faster than the first time. Since the antibodies are produced quickly, the pathogen can't reproduce and cause symptoms. The individual is now considered to be immune. Here is a graph that shows that for the first and second exposure to a particular pathogen. You can see the first exposure to the pathogen, it takes some time to make antibodies. But once you have that second exposure to the pathogen, the antibody response is much more rapid. Some questions to be considering after this first part is, what is the immune system's first line of defense against pathogens? Why is the third line of defense to be considered specific? And how does your immune system remember a past infection? Part 2 involves the immunity response. From following terms would be helpful to know by the end of this lesson. And some questions to think about to help guide your learning include: what does it mean to be immune to something? Why is it dangerous if someone has a virus but doesn't look sick? And finally, have you ever received a vaccination for something? And if so, what was it for? Our immune system will learn from past infections. Immunity means being protected by something and being unaffected by it. Once you've been infected with and recovered from a certain pathogen, it usually will not make you sick again. You become immune to that particular pathogen. There are 2 types of immunity. Active immunity involves the production of antibodies by the body itself, and then the transfer of that to memory cells. This is considered a long-term immunity. And there are 2 types: natural and artificial active immunity. In natural active immunity, there's the creation of antibodies to a specific pathogen as a result of infection by an actual pathogen. In artificial active immunity, there's the creation of antibodies to a specific pathogen as a result of exposure to a weakened pathogen. And an example of that would be vaccination. The second type of immunity is passive immunity. That is immunity that involves receiving antibodies from another source, and it does not involve memory cells. Typically, this is considered a shorter-term immunity. There are also 2 types of passive immunity, natural and artificial. And that should say passive, not active there. In natural passive immunity, you will receive natural antibodies from another organism, such as a mother to her newborn infant. An example of natural passive immunity would be receiving antibodies in breast milk. In artificial passive immunity, you will be receiving manufactured antibodies by external delivery methods, such as passive vaccines. An example here would be transfusions in vaccines. Okay, just to summarize those last 2 slides, there's active immunity and there's natural and artificial. Natural active immunity would be infection itself. Artificial active immunity would be vaccination. Passive immunity can be natural and artificial. Example of natural passive immunity would be receiving maternal antibodies. And an example of artificial passive immunity would be receiving monoclonal antibodies through a vaccine. Vaccines are a weakened form of a pathogen that contains antigens but cannot trigger the disease. Vaccines induce immunity by a specific pathogen by stimulating the production of immune memory cells. Vaccination not only gives immunity to the individual, but also indirectly protects non-vaccinated people by something called herd immunity. The example here is that if we had, in the blue here, if there was no immunization and you had a group of people where 2 people are contagious and everyone is susceptible, then you're going to have that transfer so that now multiple people are contagious because the pathogen can pass freely between contagious to susceptible individuals. With immunization, pathogens cannot pass freely from immunized to susceptible individuals. So you can have a few contagious individuals, but because most people are immunized, the chances of that contagion being passed from one person to a susceptible individual are much less. Today, many diseases, in fact, are prevented by vaccines, including chickenpox, polio, and tetanus. Finally, we're just going to talk briefly about some disorders of the immune system. Non-autoimmune disorders, and I will define what that means in a second, include seasonal allergies, food allergies, both of which are immune response caused by oversensitivity to a particular allergen, be it environmental or food, asthma, which is an inflammation of a person's airways due to exposure of different triggers, eczema, HIV and AIDS, and leukemia, which is a cancer of blood-forming tissues resulting in overproduction of white cells, which hinders immune system function. Autoimmune diseases are what occurs when your body's immune system that normally fights off pathogens, normally your body's immune system will fight off pathogens that come from outside your body. However, sometimes the immune system will begin to attack the body itself. When this occurs, the patient has an autoimmune disease. In an autoimmune disease, you have a healthy immune system, which is like an army, that protects you against germs and illness. Normally, it will make antibodies that are special chemicals to fight microbes. Sometimes that army then will get confused and begin attacking healthy cells in your body. It does that by making autoantibodies, which are antibodies that attack the body's own cells. In autoimmune diseases, the immune system attacks healthy cells, tissues, and organs. This type of attack causes a destructive process called the inflammatory response. Inflammation can cause all sorts of problems, including swelling, soreness, and pain. There are many different types of autoimmune diseases, each which affects the body in different ways. For example, you can have psoriasis, which affects the skin, rheumatoid arthritis, which affects the joints, and lupus, which affects a wide range of tissues and organs. And that will conclude the immune system.